Hold on a sec. Where's your spare barrel? Spare barrel? Well, yeah. You're supposed to have a lock, stock, and 2 smoking barrels. Where is he? Where have you been? Well, getting the spare barrel like you wanted. Okay, great. Yeah, What are you going to do with that? Well, I don't know. Here, you take it. I kind of got my hands full here, Okay? Don't you have a number 2? Yeah, I do. It's right here. Not the number 2 barrel, you idiot. You're number 2. You know the guy that carries all the ammunition for that thing? Well, yeah, he's over there. Fine. We're gonna die. By the time the Great War ended, the concept of a mobile machine gun used at platoon level as the foundation of infantry tactics was well established. Moreover, it saw the defeat of the Imperial German Army, playing its own role in the combined arms battle. Though every man within the platoon had some knowledge of its use in operation, it was still a somewhat specialized weapon. This would change considerably through the years of peace as time and the ability to train increased, but would fundamentally shift when the infantry adopted its new machine gun, the Bren, and a new organization to go with it. Now, all men would be trained equally on the section's light machine gun, just as they were on the rifle. This system was fundamental in infantry training and reflected the importance of the Bren within this new paradigm. The drills used to bring it into action and what to do if it stopped firing were particularly important.
It's jammed! Regulator!
While obviously a theatrical depiction of the appropriate drills, this nevertheless aptly demonstrates the importance of the timely and immediate steps taken when the Bren suffered a stoppage in action. Bringing it back to a firing state was paramount and demanded good, well-practiced skills. In this video, we'll examine the training delivered for the Bren and the standards that the men had to achieve in order to be proficient in its use before qualifying with it on the range. As with all weapons, many hours were spent learning and practicing before a shot was even fired. The nature of the Bren, necessarily more mechanical than, say, the rifle, demanded a larger suite of skills to operate. Many of the fundamentals of musketry and marksmanship were in common with the rifle, and thereby less time need be devoted to them during training with the light machine gun. There were, however, many aspects of a more complex nature that required their own dedicated time to train to. By way of demonstration, these examples of the training syllabus are particularly telling. There were 11 hours of Bren training devoted to learning its use, not including shooting on the range, with a further 22 hours spent reinforcing previous lessons and expanding on them once the men joined their units after leaving the recruit depot. When the training system was revamped in 1942, some 44 45-minute periods or 33 hours were committed, including range time. As you can see, the emphasis on the Bren was considerable and worthy of its importance in both the infantry and also in the greater army context. As with most musketry subjects, a certain degree of theory needed attention before hands-on practice could start. The theory of small arms fire was taught from the very outset, and indeed the concepts here were not only pertinent to the Bren. Fire delivered, no matter how careful the aim or steady the position, will always deviate to a degree from one round to the next. This is true of a rifle or a machine gun. A number of factors affect the trajectory, including weather and temperature, small deviations in manufacture, the aforementioned skill of the firer, and vibrations and recoil of, in this case, the machine gun. This results in the rounds passing through a vertical plane in a pattern known as the cone of fire. As we follow these multiple trajectories, the bullets will eventually fall to earth, on the theoretical horizontal plane in a pattern known as the beaten zone. While the cone of fire might be somewhat circular in shape, the beaten zone will be more exaggerated in its length than width, yielding a more lozenge shape pattern. Naturally, more rounds will fall into the center of this pattern, and this was known as the effective beaten zone. For the Bren, this was some 175 yards long and 6 feet wide at 500 yards, and 115 yards by 12 feet in width at 1,000 yards. Generally speaking, the closer the range, the longer and more narrow the beaten zone is, while the longer the range, the shorter and wider it is, as shown here. These diagrams being representative of Vickers beaten zones, but the concept remains consistent. The ground at the terminal end of the bullet's trajectory was referred to with 3 different terms. The aforementioned beaten zone, where the bullets actually hit the ground. The space just shy of the beaten zone, where the bullet trajectories fell below the height of the target, was known as the dangerous space. And these 2 areas combined to form the dangerous zone. Don't ask me where the highway that takes you to it is. Essentially, the dangerous zone was the area where the target could theoretically be hit. Note how this zone includes the entire height of the target, from the top of the head to the foot. If the target was either beyond or shy of the dangerous zone, it would theoretically be safe. The general idea of engaging a target was to place the effective beaten zone centralized on the target. As you can see in this diagram, some degree of error could be accommodated due to the dimensions thereof, but if the range estimation was way off, the target would be unscathed. Apart from the degree of leeway afforded by massed or automatic fire in hitting the target, the real power, especially of automatic fire, was manifest inside a certain range, whereby the trajectory of the bullet did not carry above the height of the target, at any point. For Mark 7 303 service ammunition, this range was a shade over 600 yards, shown here in red. Within this range, terrain notwithstanding, an enemy could be hit at any point. This was the true power of automatic fire, as it could effectively deny huge swaths of ground to the enemy, and if they were unfortunate enough to be caught in this area, they could and would be under effective fire. Terrain was of course a huge factor in the effect of fire. Seen here, the effect of the slope on the beaten zone, ranging from extremely shortened or extremely elongated as the ground changed. Of course, interruptions could be caused by intervening features such as walls or hills. Given these characteristics, targets could be engaged in a number of ways. When the target was perpendicular to the gun, as here, a group of enemy, but it could be a woodline or a trench system just as easily, bursts were fired with subsequent change in direction, placing them next to each other, and thereby covering the target with fire, though not all at the same time. This was known as traversing fire, and was achieved with the Bren by simply aiming to the right or left upon each burst. When the axis of the target was parallel to the line of fire, and perhaps longer than the beaten zone, a series of bursts could be fired, with ever-increasing range. This placed the beaten zones end to end, and was known as searching fire. Now this was perhaps better demonstrated by a weapon such as the Vickers with a graduated elevating mechanism, but the concept here remains the same. Finally, the goal of machine gun engagements was to match the long axis of the target with the long axis of the beaten zone. This was the truly devastating effect of machine gun fire realized, and was known as enfilading fire. Thus, with a solid understanding of the weapon's characteristics, the soldier could then progress and learn further subjects of a more hands-on variety. A time-honored piece of introductory training was the naming of the parts. The Bren was an exceptionally well-designed weapon, and its many parts were easily stripped for maintenance and cleaning. This example here is a Mark I modified, but the general concepts in stripping and assembling remained the same for all Marks. The Bren, when stripped, was broken into 4 main groupings of parts: the piston group, the barrel group, the butt group, and the body group. The magazine was considered separate. Now, this next segment might be a bit gratuitous, but these pictures are way too nice to pass up the opportunity for at least a reasonable presentation. The main parts of the piston group were the gas piston extension, and the breech block. Here we see details of the piston head and piston rings, the ejection slot in the piston extension, and here we see the end of the piston extension with the piston post, the guide rib, and the return spring rod recess. The face of the breech block featured the extractor, the firing pin, the feed piece, and the groove cut down the middle known as the ejector way. Here, the exploded view of the extractor, extractor stay, and spring. The barrel group, apart from the barrel proper, featured the following parts: the carrying handle, gas block, foresight, flash eliminator, gas regulator, and the barrel locking threads. The geometry of the breech was quite complicated, allowing clearance for the feed piece and extractor. The gas regulator featured 4 settings, indicated by dots engraved on its surface. These were aligned with the 0 mark to indicate the appropriate gas setting. The gas block featured the gas passage to its rear, and here we can see the retainer pin on the other side of the gas regulator. This view of the stripped regulator shows its retainer pin and gas ports. The butt group consisted of the guide rib, the piston buffer and spring, the body locking pin slot, the butt plate, the butt swivel, and the change lever. In addition, both the rear and front mounting pins, the pistol grip, and the trigger mechanism with sear. These views show the front mounting pin in its closed and open position. And here from below the ejection opening cover, both in its closed and open position. With the return spring rod moved out of the way, we can see the position of the sear. The body group featured the magazine catch, the magazine opening cover, the barrel nut recess, the gas cylinder, the back sight drum, and the body locking pin. In addition, the bipod was its own subassembly. At the front of the gas cylinder, we can see the gas shield, the fouling holes, and the gas cylinder locking bar, while the barrel nut featured the barrel locking threads and the barrel nut catch. Here we can see the magazine opening cover in its closed and open position. And at the rear of the magazine opening, the magazine catch and the ejector. This view shows the body locking pin in the open position. The bipod with its extendable legs could be folded to the rear or to the front. Naming of the parts was only a means to an end. Important, nonetheless, as moving forward, there was now a common frame of reference as training progressed, including stripping and assembling. The first step was to render the gun safe by first removing the magazine, then cocking the gun, then allowing springs to ease. The body locking pin was pushed out from left to right, and the butt group moved to the rear until it stopped. The return spring rod was pivoted out of the way, and the piston group removed, using the cocking handle if required. The breech block was separated by sliding it off the piston extension clear of the piston post. The extractor was then removed from the breech block. A handy method was to invert the breech block and then lift gently the extractor out of its slot. The extractor stay and spring could then follow. Now, there was no formal prescription on how to lay out the parts, but a simple, logical pattern from left to right would guarantee the keeping track of all the parts for later cleaning. The barrel group was then removed by first repositioning the carrying handle and then lifting up on the barrel nut catch, rotating the barrel nut. The barrel could then be drawn straight off the gun. The regulator was then stripped by using either a spare round or the Bren combination tool to rotate the regulator so that the retainer pin lined up with the slot in the gas block, and then pushed out to the left. If excessive fouling made this operation difficult, the combination tool and its copper drift could be used to push the regulator out of the gas block. The butt group was then slid off. There was no further stripping of this component during ordinary stripping. The barrel nut was removed by first using the magazine opening cover to depress the barrel nut détente, and then lifting the barrel nut up out of its recess. The bipod was removed by rotating it clockwise off the end of the gas cylinder, or vice versa, by rotating the body group counterclockwise. For ordinary stripping, there was no further action. The magazine was stripped by using a spare round to depress the détente in the bottom plate, then carefully sliding it off the magazine, exposing the spring and platform. These were carefully removed under control. The Bren, being a gas-operated weapon, naturally required somewhat more attention than, say, a rifle. That said, the general concepts of dealing with fouling and the maintenance of metal and wood parts alike were certainly in common. The Bren served all over the world, and its cleanliness was a priority, regardless of the climatic conditions of its use. For care and maintenance, the necessary parts, supplies, and implements were carried in the holdall. In the large outer pouch, the spare parts wallet was carried. Now this was the only such item generally carried in the field, the holdall and its spare barrel not usually required. The inside of the wallet had a number of compartments that held perhaps the more commonly needed accessories. An oil can containing the usual gun oil, this example being made of plastic and commonly more associated with the post-war era. Wartime versions were made of metal. The combination tool, a Mark II version here, a pull-through with wire gauze attached, some 4x2 cleaning material, and a spare parts tin, including gas keys or reamers, various replacement springs, the clearing plug, and spare extractor, stay, and spring. The remaining pockets of the holdall contained officially a spare breech block, but in this case a later pattern gas cylinder brush, and tool defouling are carried here, a double pull-through, graphite grease, substituted here is a modern oil bottle, and a tin of oil low cold test for use in lower winter temperatures, which was held in a similar tin to that we've already seen. Inside the holdall was of course the spare barrel and the cleaning rod, shown here with the mop attached. Added to this was an obligatory oily rag. The piston group was cleaned without too much special attention. Naturally, the head and rings of the piston would attract the lion's share of the fouling, but generally the combination of oil, the rag, and a little bit of elbow grease would see the fouling removed. Now, no abrasive or damaging materials or tools were allowed to be used for cleaning, but my suppositions lean towards certain tricks and cheats that may have been employed to expedite the cleaning of fouling resulting from very heavy use. The breech block was cleaned in a similar way, with special attention being paid to the claw of the extractor. Cleaning of the barrel relied on some tried and trusted techniques. Remembering that Mark VII 303 service ammunition was primed with corrosive primers, barrels of all weapons needed to be, quote, boiled out, by pouring a moderate amount of boiling water down the barrel. This dissolved and flushed out the salts which were left after firing, which would combine with moisture in the air and corrode the bore over time. If there was any persistent fouling, the next step was to pull through the bore with the wire gauze. These small pieces of wire mesh were wrapped around the center loop of the pull-through with an S-type technique. The idea was that this would apply some mild abrasion to the bore in order to loosen fouling. It was moderately finicky to wrap, but once it was on, it did not need to be removed. The barrel was then pulled through from breech to muzzle by inserting the weight of the pull-through at the breech, then inverting the barrel and pulling the pull-through through, and pulling the pull-through through, say that 10 times fast, with the gauze and perhaps some oil scouring out the fouling. It would be repeated as much as necessary, followed by further pulling through with a piece of 4x2 or cotton flannelette placed through the end loop of the pull-through. This would mop out any last fouling, and when complete, an oily 4x2 was applied if the weapon wasn't going immediately back into action. The use of the double pull-through demanded 3 men to accomplish, and although it's mentioned in the references, its use is not. The idea was that the 4x2, or gauze, could be repeatedly drawn back and forth through the barrel, with a man on either end of the pull-through and one holding the barrel. The gas block was cleaned with the rag, and the gas keys were used to clear fouling from the gas passage. The keys were also used to clear the gas ports in the regulator, the various keys being used in the appropriately sized ports. The flash eliminator could be scraped using the end of the Mark I combination tool, it having 3 cutting edges designed for that purpose. Cleaning the butt group was fairly straightforward. The wood was wiped clean, and the guide ribs and trigger mechanism were likewise. The body group commanded somewhat more attention due to its gas-affected parts. The outside received the usual treatment. The end of the gas cylinder could be cleaned with the tool defouling. This was placed in the mouth of the gas cylinder like a pair of pliers, gently squeezed, and then rotated to loosen caked-on fouling from the inside. Following that, the brush could be attached to the cleaning rod. Here, the available examples of brush and rod are not of the compatible pattern, but suffice it to say that the brush was worked back and forth inside the gas cylinder, further loosening the fouling. Finally, a 4x4 piece of flannelette was placed over the mop, and the cylinder cleaned of the last of the fouling. For firing, the cylinder was left dry, but otherwise received a light coat of oil. The gas keys could be used to clean the holes on the side of the gas cylinder. The barrel nut received the common treatment of oil and rag, as did the parts of the bipod, the feet, extendable legs, and the spring and hinge at its top. Though not shown here, the parts of the magazine were cleaned in a similar fashion. With the gun stripped and clean, it could then be assembled. The bipod was replaced on the end of the gas cylinder by offsetting it to the left and then rotating it into position. The barrel nut was then replaced, ensuring the détente was out of the way, which was then released by the movement of the magazine opening cover. The butt group, and the guide ribs specifically, were fed into the bottom of the body group, where it was slid forward. The regulator was then replaced in the gas block, ensuring the correct setting was applied. Unless the gun could be fired to verify, the setting used was either 2 or 3. The barrel group was then placed on the weapon, ensuring that the gas cylinder locking bar properly mated with the slot in the gas regulator. The barrel was locked in position by rotating the barrel nut down, engaging the barrel nut catch. The piston group was assembled by first replacing the extractor stay and spring and the extractor on the face of the breech block. The extractor stay was replaced, ensuring that the beveled side faced the ejector, then clicked into place with firm downward pressure. The breech block was then slid onto the piston extension, ensuring that the piston post was properly positioned within. Note the 2 positions of the breech block, here in the locked and the unlocked position. When placed back in the weapon, it was to be positioned forward in the latter. This was done by moving the return spring rod out of the way and then sliding the piston group gently inside the body group. The butt group was pushed home and the body locking pin closed. If required, the magazine was assembled by first placing the platform inside the body of the magazine, then compressing the spring behind it. The plate was then slid on, ensuring that the détente held it firmly in place. Thus, with stripping, assembling, and cleaning taught, the Bren could be properly maintained in the field. The mechanism of the Bren was important, as knowing this would make the remedying of stoppages more easily understood. Upon moving the change lever to automatic, the tripping lever was forced down, allowing for the sear to be held out of the way until the trigger was released. When the trigger was pressed, the sear dropped and disengaged from the bent or ledge at the bottom of the piston extension, allowing the piston group to move forward under pressure from the return spring and rod. As the piston moved forward, the feed piece on top of the breech block caught the next round in the magazine, feeding it into the chamber. As the breech block completed its forward movement at the breech, the continued forward movement of the piston extension cammed the breech block up, locking it in front of the locking shoulders beneath the magazine catch. At the very end of its movement, with the breech block safely locked, the piston post hit the rear of the firing pin, firing the round. As the round traveled down the barrel, some of the gas was diverted out the gas vent, through the gas regulator, and down the gas passage, where it met the head of the piston, driving it to the rear. As the piston head moved back, it passed the gas holes, both in front of the gas shield and at the sides of the gas cylinder, where it allowed for the gas to escape, lowering the pressure on the working parts. The initial rearward movement of the piston extension caused the breech block to cam downwards, unlocking it from the locking shoulders. Once this occurred, the breech block was carried along, beginning the extraction of the spent case. As the piston group moved rearward, it compressed the return spring by pushing on the return spring rod. When the case met the ejector, positioned as it was in the ejector way, it struck the upper portion of the case head, which, in conjunction with the extractor gripping the lower part of the rim, pivoted the case downward through the ejection slot in the piston extension and out the ejection opening. If the trigger remained pressed, the cycle began again, and if the trigger was released, the sear caught in the bent, and firing stopped. Magazine filling required a certain degree of attention. The .303 service ammunition did have a rim on the case, and so care had to be taken to ensure that the magazine was loaded correctly and that the rims did not overlap in the wrong direction. While this sounds like something that would have been a weakness of this system, by using the presented, proper, and very simple technique, the instances of any jams or other difficulties were avoided. The magazine was placed on the left thigh, with it curving towards the body. A charger of 5 rounds was held in the left hand, and the rounds stripped out of it with the right. As they were placed one at a time on the platform or follower, well shy of their fully seated position, by pushing down and away with the thumb, the round was pushed to the rear of the magazine, fully seating it, and ensuring the rim of the cartridge was on the correct side of the one below it. In this view, note the use of a J-stroke used with the thumb pushing the cartridges to the rear of the magazine. The magazines were charged with 28 rounds to ensure a buffer of reliability was kept. Once charged, the magazines were stored for use on the man in his basic pouches, which held 2, in the utility pouches, which held 3, or in the magazine box, which held 12. The most basic position used with the Bren was the prone position. It held a number of salient features which would ensure good drills and, more importantly, good, accurate shooting. With the gun either in the action or ready position with the butt on the ground, or the fire position with the gun in the shoulder, the body was kept straight behind the gun with the feet together. The toes were rested or dug into the ground rather than lying flat. In the shoulder, the left hand gripped the small of the butt in an overhand style, and the right hand held the pistol grip firmly. The right cheek was placed firmly on the butt, allowing for the appropriate sight picture. This view shows the correct alignment of the position. Note the body is in a straight line with the gun, and that both shoulders and elbows were positioned square to its axis. These aspects were intended to mitigate recoil and ensure that the forces acting on the body by the gun firing were transferred straight back and would not adversely affect the subsequent rounds of the burst. Failure to observe these points would see the gun recoil with a sideways bias, impacting the cone of fire negatively. We can see this position and its fundamentals exhibited in countless images from the period. Loading the Bren, indeed all weapons of the era, saw the weapon ready to fire. On the appropriate command,
Load!
first the magazine opening cover was slid forward and a magazine was withdrawn from the pouch. It was inserted with the front edge first into the opening and rocked back. The gun was then cocked with the right hand, ensuring the cocking handle was pushed fully forward. The safety catch was placed on safe if not already there, and finally the pouch was done up and the firer awaited further orders. The Bren was typically crewed by 2 men. The number 1 had the gun, while the number 2 supplied the ammunition and carried the spare barrel and holdall if required. To that end, the loading evolution looked like this.
Load!
The number 1 opened the magazine opening cover, and immediately the number 2 placed a full magazine on the gun. All other aspects were the same. Note the immediate placement of another full magazine in a position ready to make a change. Unloading was achieved thus.
Unload!
The magazine was removed, then the action fired, cocked, and fired again. The magazine and ejection opening covers were then slid shut, and finally the magazine was returned to the pouch. It's important to note that during routine firing the action would have been held to the rear. Thus, when the magazine was withdrawn, the action empty and no rounds were available to chamber. The drill could also be performed with the number 2, and the main functions were the same.
Unload!
The magazine was passed under the gun for the number 2 to secure, while the number 1 cleared the gun and closed the magazine and ejection opening covers. And the sights, if adjusted previously, were returned to 200. Once the basic skills of holding, magazine filling, loading and unloading were taught, aiming and firing could then be practiced. Before firing could commence, the sights had to be adjusted. Bren sights were graduated from 200 to 2,000 yards. In order to adjust them, the drum of the Mark I was turned towards the firer. This raised the rear sight to the appropriate elevation marked on the drum. The Mark II had a simplified ladder sight, with adjustment effected by turning the knob at its top. With the sights adjusted, proper aiming could take place. The arrangement of sights provided a rear aperture, through which was centered the front sight, and that on the center of the target. For service targets as well as live targets, the point of aim was the center of the figure or visible mass. In order to evaluate a firer's sight picture, a device known as an eye disc was used. This relied on a miniature target painted on its face with a small hole punched through at the point of aim. Now, we've looked at the use of the eye disc both in the musketry of 1914 series and the musketry of the Second World War series. Its use with the Bren was no different. The firer would aim at this pinhole, and the instructor would look through the hole back along the sights to the man's eyeball. Thus, the instructor could assess whether the man was using the correct sight picture. For proper use, the eye disc was placed about 1 yard from the muzzle.
300.
Men were drilled by applying sight settings and then aiming and firing at the eye disc. For these drills, the Bren was used without magazine or dummy
500.
rounds, though the weapon indeed was dry-fired to check the maintenance of the sight picture during firing. Here, a more rudimentary form of the drill is presented,
600.
without firing the action. We will see later on a more complete form of this evolution.
300. Aim.
Once the sight picture was confirmed as correct, a landscape target could be used to give a more realistic point of aim.
700.
These drills taught the man rapid sight setting and acquisition of the target through the sights.
350. Aim.
The Bren was to be fired with various rates of fire in mind. These were slow, single rounds, rapid, and a prescribed technique for shooting at a moving enemy. The latter wasn't necessarily a rate of fire as much as it was a technique that prescribed firing of longer bursts, between 8 and 10 rounds, at a point in front of the target, as it moved from left to right or right to left. Firing single rounds with the change lever on R for repetition was to be conducted at 30 rounds per minute. Automatic shooting was to be either slow or rapid, with the former fired at 1 mag per minute, with pauses of between 5 and 12 seconds between bursts, depending on their length. Note here the longer pause between bursts. Slow rate was used for longer range, where more care was necessary, or for when the immediacy of the need for firepower was diminished. Rapid rate was fired at 4 mags per minute, with only pauses enough to allow for aiming. This brings us to the end of Part 1 of preliminary training. In Part 2, we'll further examine the drills used with the Bren, some of the fieldcraft and usage therein, and the tests of elementary training that had to be passed before firing on the range. As usual, the project couldn't have been completed without many generous and helpful people. Thanks to friends of the channel, Jarrett, a regular China plate to quote a phrase, who lent his body and back to performing the number 2 drills, and to Bill for the use of the cutaway Bren. Thanks to Rich at the Vickers Machine Gun Collection and Research Association for providing the main references for this project. And of course, this video would not have been made had it not been for Cian Arsenal and their incredible close-knit community of friends. My undying thanks and appreciation go to all those who, by hook or by crook, or by the kindness of their hearts, decided to contribute as they could to make my visit such a success. Your hospitality, energy, generosity, and expertise are beyond reproach. Particular thanks need to be extended to Sven for provision of the Bren and copious amounts of ammunition. Matthias, May, Susie, David, Kristen, Sven, Hill, Jeff, Thomas, Henry, Aidan, and Bruno. You all spent untold hours of wrangling and sourcing the 14.5 million things that were needed to bring this project to fruition. I am truly humbled. In addition, thanks must be extended to James and the staff at the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada Museum and Archive for making available some of the arms seen in this project for photography and use. If you'd like to support the channel, please stop by our Patreon page. The link is in the description below. For more information on projects and updates between videos, follow us on our Facebook page. What was once Utreon is now Player. It still remains a good alternative to YouTube and Patreon, as those platforms have become rather troublesome for content as found on this channel. May I suggest following British muzzleloaders there as well.